Today is August 3rd, and we're here at the Freiburg New Church Assembly. We're talking about George's article, which interestingly is called The New Church. I wondered if you read the article, if you also wondered, like I did, why in the world did he call it The New Church, the article? He basically doesn't mention religion, doesn't mention Christianity, doesn't mention our denomination, doesn't mention Jesus, and yet the article is titled The New Church. I did a talk for the Washington, D.C. church several months ago, and I titled it, Is Swedenborgianism Even Christian? And I thought of Jesus, who obviously thought of himself as Jewish, not as a Christian, but he still became the basis of a whole new religion, which doesn't think of itself as Jewish anymore. Swedenborg certainly thought of himself as a Christian, while yet he heralded in a whole new way of thinking about church. So I often remark that Swedenborg's new church is at least as different from Christianity as Christianity was from Judaism. So I think when we think of ourselves specifically as Christian, we're limiting the scope of what could be called the new church. George talked about Gard mentioned George talking about globalism, and it reminded me of, he was looking at the new church in a more than a Christian way, and I found this other Messenger article written 1 year before the one we're talking about. So this was published in July, August of 2020. And he's talking all about globalism and a little bit about world peace. He mentions in this article Blake, he says, William Blake attended the first session of the first General Conference of Swedenborg in London in 1789. And that was when his hostile attitude towards Swedenborg began. It says, it's fertile ground for imagination. Blake had read Swedenborg's Divine Love and Wisdom and had reacted with passionate enthusiasm. He then attended a meeting where 32 theological propositions, none drawn from Divine Love and Wisdom, were proposed, discussed, and unanimously adopted as justifying the founding of a separate church organization. In a sense, Blake must have seen his own liberation theology dogmatized in the very words of the theologian he had seen as the liberator. And in this article on basically on globalism, but he calls it For Heaven's Sake in 2020, he says, well then as a church, where do we go from here? Step one is to figure out where we are. From a distance of 3 centuries, I find it sad that those Swedenborgians who founded the organized new church made it a virtual carbon copy of the old church. Henry James Sr. wasted no words on this matter. Addressing the Swedenborgian church in 1870, he wrote, I know of no sect so young that gives such unequivocal proofs of senility as your own. So I think we could also ask, is Swedenborgianism Swedenborgian? You know, if we look at it that way. I think when George called his article The New Church, and then didn't write about Christianity or church, he was making the point that the new church is not a religion, not a denomination, or even a belief system, but rather the process of inner spiritual growth, which is what the article focuses on. So then we could ask, well, what is the new church? And what is George talking about in this article? He quoted Swedenborg in the article saying, in the new church, there will be no external that is not separated from its internal. This reminded me of a sermon I had given over 20 years ago that I called Inner Peace Through Inner Correspondence. We all know about correspondence. Swedenborg certainly wrote about it a lot. There's basically kind of three levels he mentioned: signs, representations, and correspondence. And he described each level. The level of signs he gave examples of like a street sign. It could be words, stop, yield, what the speed limit, so forth, things like that. And then he had the intermediate level he called representations. It could be, it could be a street sign again, but maybe a squiggly line, which we all recognize. Oh, there's a curve up ahead. So the squiggly line represents the street, and we all recognize that. So or a map, we can say these lines represent roads. So it represents reality like pictures do. For us personally, a nod of agreement or a smile or a frown, laughing, crying, hugging, and so forth, these all represent what we're thinking or feeling. So if we nod, we're representing that we agree. If we smile, we're representing happiness, and so forth. And yet, of course, signs and representations can also be true or false. They can be completely false. Actors obviously don't necessarily feel what they're acting or believe what they're saying in a movie. And same with us. We can intentionally deceive people. Or maybe we just want to hide our true thoughts. Somebody says, "How are you?" Most of us nod and say, "Fine," and we smile. Well, we may not even be happy, really. We may not even be feeling fine, but maybe we don't want to get into it. We don't want to tell them how we're truly feeling. So we may be just hiding, not wanting to get into things about our lives or whatever. Or we may have some reason we just want to actually pretend we agree with someone or pretend that we're happy. So these signs and representations can be either true or false. George started his article saying, "It is safe to say, I believe, that none of us would relish having all our secret thoughts and feelings made public." So often we don't show in an external way what we're feeling internally. And he's saying, that eventually these internals will become known, or our inner will become known. Maybe not until we die, but in the meantime, we can sometimes relate our true feelings with our smile and sometimes not. Anyway, the innermost level Swedenborg called correspondence, and we mostly refer to the relationship between the physical and the spiritual worlds. So he used thousands of references that this corresponds to this, and obviously things like heat correspond to love, light corresponds to wisdom, and so forth. There's even a book called Swedenborg's Dictionary of Correspondence, based on his writings, where you can look up any word and it'll tell in a spiritual world, what does this correspond to. Now, it can be misleading, of course, because just like in a dream, I might dream about a horse and it means something completely different than when you dream about a horse, because we have different ideas or feelings about horses. Well, it's the same with correspondence. Swedenborg says, well, it depends on the spiritual use of whatever the word is. So the same thing can have many correspondences. Water could correspond to truth in some general way, but it depends. Are we drinking the water? Are we washing ourselves, bathing ourselves? Or even is there a flood? It's like water can, depending on the use, obviously if we're bathing ourselves, maybe it corresponds to purification and so forth. And so you can basically look at any word or any concept and say, what is its use? And then you can say there's a spiritual use, just like washing ourselves, we're cleaning ourselves, but spiritually we can also correspond to cleaning ourselves and spiritual purification. So we think about the correspondence generally as the relationship between the natural and spiritual worlds, which it is. But the important thing is that we are both physical and spiritual beings. So there's a correspondence within ourselves between our natural physical self and our internal spiritual self. Swedenborg wrote in Arcana Celestia, "Blessed is the person who is in correspondence, that is, whose external self corresponds to their internal self." So what I'm interested in is what I said, the inner correspondence. How do we correspond to ourselves? According to Swedenborg, there's three kind of primary components that make us human. I would say for Swedenborg, these are the divine trinity: love, truth, and use, or action. Or you could say we manifest love in what we feel, what we want, what we desire. We manifest truth in what we think or believe, our understanding. And we manifest use in what we do, how we act, what we say. So these are the things, the three levels that make us human, and these are the things that need to correspond. That's really the goal. We need these three things to be in alignment. When they're not in alignment, there's inner conflict, disharmony, and if they are in alignment, then when they correspond, then there is harmony and inner peace. So of course this requires self-examination. We need to know ourselves, and George mentions that in the article, that this self-examination is so important, because we need to know what we feel and what we believe, and we need our actions to rightly reflect those. George wrote, "Our greatest weapon in the struggle between these two ways of life would seem to be honesty, specifically honesty with ourselves. There can be no pretense in the new church, no external which is at odds with its internal." So I think this inner correspondence is the key to inner peace. And we have to look at our feelings and what we want and see if that aligns with what we believe, or vice versa. Sometimes we look at what we believe and we say, is this a loving thing? Or George used that example that Gard mentioned this morning of if something is true if it leads us toward greater love, and something is loving if it helps me love the neighbor more. And so we can use our rationality, as Swedenborg says. We're kind of always balancing what we think and what we feel, or what we love and how we understand it. So these are two things we go back and forth. We can look at our desires and our feelings and say, intellectually, is this a loving thing? Is this the right thing? And then we can use our love in order to help us know what the right beliefs are, and what we should believe, how to understand the world. If we don't feel good about what we believe, or we don't think that what we feel is okay, or we're not acting in line with what we think and feel, then we're not in correspondence with ourselves. So many people live their whole lives in disharmony, which creates conflict, unhappiness, and disease. So that's why we have to examine our thoughts and beliefs, our feelings and desires, our speech, our actions, and see if these are in alignment. And then we need to change our beliefs, change our actions if they're not in alignment. And this inner correspondence, we can sometimes think, well, this is bad, we're not in there's a conflict within us, and yet this is the whole point of life, that to have this conflict. This is how we grow. This is how we become regenerate, is by questioning, is this back and forth between our rationality, our understanding, and our desires. And so that's why it's so important to be always questioning them, because if there wasn't any disharmony, we would never question our beliefs, we would never question our actions, we would just kind of blindly go forward. So it's by this very process, that's how we grow. Otherwise we would never change what we believe, we would never change what we do. So it's both a goal and a process. And some days we're better at it than others. Sometimes we're very kind and loving and we feel good and we seem to try to understand people, and other times we're more closed-minded, we're not as thoughtful, we're not as nice. George called it in this article, he said, some days we're close. He said, these are our new church days. He said, I thought that was interesting because here he's talking about church and, like I said, not even mentioning religion. But he said when our inner self and our outer self are in alignment, he says those are our new church days. But then he says, but on other days, we're not that way, and there's more disharmony, more conflict within us. So we shouldn't despair that we're not always in our new church days. Allison on last Friday asked if we were ready for complete healing. And obviously, I think the answer was no. And again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. If we were completely healed, if we were in complete inner correspondence, then our life journey would be done. We'd have nothing left to do here, because this is the life process, is to heal this disharmony, heal these inner conflicts, and become our true selves. So we might recognize feelings and intentions which aren't compassionate. We might think rationally about what we want to change. We might realize that our thoughts and beliefs are not true or compassionate or in alignment with our values. And we might realize our words and actions don't correspond to what we want, what we believe. So it's in recognizing this disharmony that we grow spiritually. So Swedenborg, again, was his trinity: love, wisdom or understanding, and our action or use. Gard also mentioned this morning the holy city, New Jerusalem, and the new church, and what George was saying about that. And it's interesting when talking about the new church, and we also call ourselves the Church of the New Jerusalem. And I think both the new church or this idea of the descent of the holy city, New Jerusalem, we like to think of our church as that, and yet these are obviously end goals. We haven't seen the descent of the holy city, New Jerusalem, on earth. We haven't created this heaven on earth yet, and we certainly haven't become the new church. So it's interesting, these are our ideas of church, but they're really goals or an end result that eventually we hope to get to the new church. Eventually we hope to get to the descent of the holy city, New Jerusalem. And these are not theological concepts. These are states of mind, states of consciousness, or as George started talking about, world peace. So I asked if you thought it was interesting that George called it the new church when it was more like an inner judgment. He even wrote, as he was talking about it, he said, and it is a very short step indeed to the strong suspicion that this is a judgment. That's the inner coming out. He said our inner selves coming out is a judgment, because that's exactly what happens when we die. So I found it not surprising that he wrote this shortly before he died. He may have been thinking about judgment. He may have been thinking about heaven and hell. He was certainly thinking a lot about the new church and what that meant, but as an inner experience, not as a theology. And I think he was becoming one with himself, recognizing and acknowledging his true inner self. And this, as I say, is a journey of a lifetime. It's what Swedenborg called regeneration. So to know ourselves, to come to peace with and alignment with our inner and outer selves, our physical and our spiritual, our human and our divine. I want to close with just one thought here. One of my Swedenborg professors, along with George Dole, when I was at the Swedenborg School, Cal Turley, he often said we can't take another person's spiritual inventory. And what he meant was we can't judge another person spiritually because all we know is their outer actions and we don't know their inner intentions and thoughts. Or as George said in the article, He said, "It is like starving people stealing food. If all we see is the theft, all we see is what is wrong, and it would be false to pretend that it's good. If we can see the need, though, we can set that wrong in its proper context and see that there's more to the individual than the single crime." So I thought it was interesting that in the end, not just his last year, but in his last several years, George Dole, who I think could mostly acknowledge as our church's greatest scholar, our greatest theologian. He translated many of the Swedenborg books. He probably wrote more about Swedenborgian theology and wrote more books than any of our other contemporary Swedenborgians. And so here he was, being revered as such a great scholar, understanding our theology better than anybody else. But here, his last several years, this wasn't his goal, or it wasn't his focus. His last articles in the Messenger, his last writings were not about Christianity, not about even Swedenborgianism in a theological way, but very much about Swedenborgianism in the sense of writing about what he still calls the new church, although obviously not a denomination. So even though we can't, so this judgment that we can see coming, like he said, the judgment is the inner becoming outer, and that's what happens when we die. So I think at the risk of going against these warnings of not taking spiritual inventory, I would say that George, I think, came close to fulfilling his life mission of knowing himself, of finding that inner correspondence, which leads to inner peace between his inner and external. So I think his judgment hopefully was an easy one, and I expect he had an easy transition to the spiritual world, because when you know yourself, you're not shocked, you're not, there's no inner conflict, because that's what happens when we die, says that's the judgment. Our internal becomes external. Because when we die, there's no more conflict between our internal and external self. We are our internal self. And that's so, we need to take advantage of this time we have on earth, because this inner conflict is a blessing. That's why we're here. We use this inner conflict to learn about ourselves, to find and to eventually become more in alignment, more this, what I call inner correspondence. I'm going to end with that, and hopefully then we have plenty of time for discussion or questions or comments. Anybody? Any questions or comments? Over here.
I would just say I really like that. Great. There might be people online that want to hear you. I want to say that I really like that. Great insights. It just makes me think of this whole spiritual process that Swedenborg himself was going through, and we're all meant to go through. And it's this inner struggle is real opportunity, and it's all about becoming awake. Even Paul was talking about it, going from becoming death to spiritual, and it's a beautiful thing to recognize that is the real church, that we are the real church, and it's all about our relationship with the Lord, and it's all going on inside of ourselves. Things are happening outside, but use everything that happens as an opportunity to reflect and see something going on in ourselves that we can change. And that, bringing that change, that positive change to others, makes a world of difference. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, I was thinking of something where we're talking about not taking other people's inventory, but Swedenborg says we are supposed to examine ourselves, which I've never really liked, because I didn't really trust myself to examine myself. And I wonder, But then I'm thinking, well, maybe we can, while we're, part of our self-examination would be to ask other people specific questions about us when we're taking our own inventory. Well, how do you see me in this situation? I'm not sure how you would do it, but I think if people ask you to help them with an inventory, then perhaps you can say something about someone else's spirituality with much caution.
Mm-hmm. Well, then what you're really saying or asking the other person is how do you see my actions and my speech? Do I sound compassionate? Do I sound like I'm trying to understand you? And so forth. The person can't really judge what I'm thinking. You know, it's like asking someone, what do I really feel? Who am I really on a deeper internal level? Well, the person doesn't really know, but they can, like I say, comment on how I'm coming across. And that can be very helpful. So you're right, I believe sharing these insights about each other and asking for feedback on ourselves can be very useful. Like I say, not because we can actually judge the person correctly or they can judge us correctly, but at least we can find out how we come across, or we can tell someone else, you know, when you do this, you act, I feel like you don't care about me at all, or you really don't understand me when you talk that way, or when you say do these things and so forth. So it can then, just like self-examination, it can help us learn to grow spiritually, because we may not know we're coming across that way without that feedback. So I do agree with you, the feedback can be extremely beneficial, so it's not the sense that we don't share these kind of things with each other. It's just that we can't really know someone else's true inner self or why they're doing what they did. We can say how they came across to us, but then they might say, well, because I was trying to, I was trying to be nice, or I was trying to do this or that, or I was afraid, or they're going to have their own reasons for their hurt, or they're, angry or fearful, whatever it is. Yes, Trevor.
It can also be really hard to ask somebody to assess yourself for you, because then you have to deal with knowing that's what they think.
Mm-hmm.
And they have to deal with knowing that they told you. I've been working for several days on a presentation I'm doing tonight on camp history, and one of the documents that I pulled up last night is from Frances Twitchell, who the Twitchell Cabin is named after. She was our first treasurer, and a very outspoken individual. And the document is a letter that someone who was putting together a flyer for the assembly, and they asked her, what you think of it? What do you think of this flyer? And she says, well, our letter's obviously crossed in the mail because you put it out before you got my comments. And so, but since you asked, I'm going to be quite frank and tell you. And she did.
Right.
You have two people online with their hands raised behind you, Paul. Lynn was first and Martha was second. If you look
Okay.
at the screen.
Let me just respond real quickly to Trevor, just for 1 second. When you say it can be scary because you might not like the feedback, I think this is the example, this is the beneficial thing of a loving relationship and of a loving community, is that you have to trust that the person doesn't hate you or they're not trying to hurt you. If you ask for the feedback, you have to trust, and when you give feedback, you have to trust that you care about each other. You're giving it in order to help each other, not to hurt each other. So I think this is why we need loving relationships, why we need good friends, why we need a loving community, so that we can feel free to share these things without the fear of hurting each other and so forth. Yes, someone online?
Hey, Paul, it's Lynn. Thank you so much. I thought it was just really, really opening for me in a way, to really look at ourselves as a community in the collection. The communication idea from Gart's lecture, I don't know your names that mentioned the communication, but communication is very, very hard on so many levels between humans. And I think as we grow, these skills of how to integrate challenging difficulties within us. We all have challenging times. We all have the season of change that we have to grow and expand. But that loving community, like you just said, is so important. And I think, we're tender. And if you believe in the sensitivities of another human being, that empathy, we worked on the first week quite a bit, the empathy within us, the empathy within the community itself. But I really want to say, church has always been kind of a shallow consciousness, and I believe table fellowship, really getting around the table. I think there were probably deeper conversations around the table than there were in church itself, but there's a change in church that happens on a spiritual level because of the readings and the teachings. So I think I long for deeper connection. I long for deeper wisdom. And Martha's up, so I'm going to let her talk, but I love Martha's wisdom and her direct consciousness. Thank you.
Welcome.
Yes. Oh, oops, sorry, I'm online. Yes, I want to respond to what Dave said. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I wanted to respond to what Dave Keating said about judging yourself. I think the biggest, sorry, my son just came in, he's got a fire call. Is that if you're saying things that you really don't believe, or if you're acting in a way that you're really not feeling inside, then that is kind of the way that you're judging. It's not so much that you don't say to myself, am I a real spiritual person, or am I on my way to heaven, or am I regenerating? What you're really asking is, when I am talking person to another, am I telling them how I really feel? And I think that's the way that you can judge that if what you're doing on the natural level is how you're really feeling inside.
Yes, I think that's very important, and it's not just whether you're being honest. It could also be why are you saying what you say? Like someone who's giving honest feedback about an article that, like Trevor mentioned, it's like, why are they giving that honest feedback? Is it a loving thing? So when you can't just say everything, it might be honest, but if you're saying it to hurt somebody, well then that's not a good thing. Or George Swedenborg would even say it's not really true, even though in a sense it's true because it's what you really think, but it says that's not real understanding to say something that you intentionally to try to hurt somebody else, even if it is the truth, supposedly.
Can I respond again
Yes.
to that? Yes, I think I meant that too. That if you regret what you said, or if you feel like it hurt someone, then that's also something that you can work on.
Yes.
I think I didn't say that, but I felt that. So thank you, Paul. Thank you very much. When I read your title, I thought, I wonder what he's going to say. But what you said was great, and I appreciate you always. Thank you.
Thank you. I think after I gave it the original title that I sent in about whether it's really new and whether it's really a church, I started rereading his article, and I thought I should have titled this Inner Correspondence, because I felt like that's what I thought George was getting at when he's talking about the new church. It was the inners coming out and this tension between our inner and outer selves. So I think that would have been a better title, Inner Correspondence.
I have to say I haven't read George's article, but one of the things that struck me is that I know how theological George was and how in-depth his knowledge of the writings was and what a scholar he was. And yet in his last few things that he published, he didn't talk deep doctrine, but he talked much more community and caring about people and much more love.
Mm-hmm.
And that was something that struck me about what's important.
Mm-hmm. I think he realized both theologically and personally that it was all about love. You know, in studying the theology so well, he realized that that's what religion's all about, becoming a more loving person. And so he was clearly working on that in himself, that he realized that's what was important for him personally, was to be a very compassionate, understanding, loving presence, not just to be some theological scholar. Any other questions, comments? Then I guess we're done. Yes.
I just, right along this theme is a great book that I just discovered. It's called The Call, and it was written by Alfred Acton. It's about Swedenborg, but it looks at, what occurred over his lifetime and how the Lord was always there leading him, and it's funny how everything just kind of fit together. But it's a great book, y'all. The Call,
Okay.
Alfred Acton. So,
Great,
anyway.
thank you.
Just one thing, I'm praying for Susanna. She had to leave because of a problem with her eye. And she would announce at this time that there will be a discussion group at 11 o'clock in here to discuss what we've heard in the lecture.
Great, so we can have more discussion. Trevor, yes.
As long as we're calling out books, I'd like to do a little call out for our library here. We have quite a few of George Dole's books. On the left as you face it, the lower shelves are all collateral literature, and it's sorted by author, of course, because our librarian is a librarian. And so you'll find it under Dole over there, several of his books if you'd like to read more. And the article that this week's lecture is about is printed out, and there's a copy of it on the the little coffee table in front of the fireplace in the Dole wing, if anybody wants to read it.
Great, thank you. Well, I will be here at 11 for the discussion group, so if you want to discuss these ideas more, Gard and I will be here to continue the discussion. Thank you.